All right, so today we're diving into something that a lot of people kind of put off thinking about, but it's super important for all of us. Wills.
Yeah,
We've
definitely.
got some legal
Yeah.
resources and some really interesting examples of wills that you all have sent in. So think of this deep dive as like a crash course in making sure your wishes, like what you want to happen, are carried out even after, well,
Right, exactly. And it's not just about like the legal stuff, right? It's also about making sure that like your choices, your values are actually respected no matter what.
Okay, so before we get into like all the details, let's just start with the basics. Like what exactly is a will, like in legal
Yeah,
terms?
so legally speaking, a will is basically like a document. It outlines how your assets, so your stuff, is going to be, distributed after you pass away. So it's about having the power to choose who gets what. Whether that's your, I don't know, your favorite books or that clock that's been in your family forever.
Right, so it's all about personal choice. And you've brought up some interesting examples to kind of illustrate how different a will can look
Yeah.
depending on, what the person's situation is. Like that first example where everything goes to the spouse. Like that's pretty simple and straightforward.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a very classic way to do it. And it often makes a lot of sense for couples, especially when you want to keep things, clear and try and avoid any potential conflicts.
Okay, so even in a simple will,
Hmm.
there can be, like, legal and financial things to keep in mind. Now, the second example we have is splitting assets equally between children.
Uh-huh.
Sounds fair, at first glance, but I can imagine how that could get complicated depending on, family dynamics.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, equal division can sound very simple. But, what happens if the children, maybe they have different financial needs, or maybe they contributed, differently to a family business. So it's not always about cutting things exactly in half. It's more about fulfilling the deceased person's wishes in a way that feels right and equitable for everyone.
Right. It's not just about the math. It's about, really understanding what was intended.
Mm.
Now, example number three, this is where things get a little bit more complex. Um, it involves a trust,
Hmm.
right? And specifically for a beneficiary with special needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And trusts, I mean, they can be incredibly powerful tools when it comes to protecting, people who might be more vulnerable. So, in this case, we're not just talking about distributing assets, but really making sure that the beneficiary is taken care of in the long term.
Right. So it's like building a safety net right into the will itself.
Exactly.
So this next example, number four, this one really, really stood out to me. It's about leaving a legacy through charitable giving. So I'm curious to hear more about how that works in practice.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually becoming, increasingly popular. People want their values, things they care about to live on, and a will is a really powerful way to do that.
Wow. So it really highlights how a will can be about so much more than just who gets your stuff. Okay, moving on to example number five. We have a situation where someone wants to leave specific things to friends or extended family members. And this seems like it could get tricky if there's a lot of, sentimental items.
Yeah, for sure. And in that case, being specific is really key. So imagine leaving your, I don't know, your watch to your nephew, but not being clear about which nephew. That's where you really need to use precise language and be legally clear to avoid any kind of, arguments or
So
misunderstandings.
it's all about being thoughtful and avoiding any ambiguity,
Yeah.
right? Okay, example number six brings up a scenario that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds, which is, what happens if you die without a will at all?
Yeah, that's called dying intestate. And it can really lead to a lot of complications
Oh, I bet.
because in that case, the distribution of your assets is basically determined by intestacy laws. And, those laws might not actually reflect what you had wanted.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah,
I mean, it really underscores why having a will, even a simple one, is just so important.
absolutely.
It gives you control and peace of mind knowing that your wishes will be followed.
Exactly.
Well, we've established that having a will is crucial, but I think a lot of people are probably wondering, like, okay, where do I even begin? It just seems daunting. Like, I don't even know where to start.
Yeah, and that's totally understandable, but really it's about taking that first step, right?
Yeah.
And the first step is just to think about your values and your priorities.
Mhm.
Like who do you want to provide for? What causes do you really care about? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? It's about the big picture.
Those are great questions to kind of sit with and think about. It's almost like creating a roadmap for your life's impact.
Exactly. Exactly. And once you have like a clearer picture in your mind about what you want, then you can start gathering the more practical information that you need for the will.
Hmm.
So, think about who you really trust to act as your executor, the person who's going to be responsible for, making sure your wishes are carried out.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that choosing an executor can be especially important in complex situations like trusts.
For sure. Yeah. If you're setting up a trust, especially for someone with, special needs, you're going to want an executor who has experience with managing that kind of arrangement. It could be a family member, it could be a professional, or even a trust company. It really depends.
So it's all about finding someone who not only understands your wishes, but also has the expertise to handle all like the legal and financial details.
Exactly, yeah. And remember, you can always talk to an estate planning professional if you need help. They can help you figure out what you need, identify any potential problems, and really just tailor your will to your specific situation.
Okay, so we've talked about the executor. Now, what about beneficiaries? Is it as simple as just, writing down the names of your loved ones?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, especially if you're leaving everything to your spouse, then yeah, it can be that straightforward. But if you're dividing things up between multiple people, then it can get a little bit more complicated. Like in that example where the assets were split between children, you might want to think about, well, does equal division really, make sense in this case?
Right, right. Because maybe one child needs more support financially, or maybe another child has been more involved in a family business or something like that. It's about being fair and not just, dividing everything exactly in half.
Exactly. And you can even specify conditions, for the inheritance. Like you could say that a beneficiary has to reach a certain age or finish, a degree or something like that before they get their inheritance.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's really about having that level of control, right?
Right.
And tailoring your will to really match your values and your intentions.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about something that I think a lot of people get confused about, which is the difference between a will and a trust.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very common question. And the main difference is that a will, it kicks in after you pass away, right? It explains how your stuff should be divided. But a trust can actually be set up while you're still alive. And it
Right.
allows you to transfer your assets to a trustee who then manages those assets for a specific beneficiary.
So with a trust, you're basically putting someone else in charge of managing those assets for someone you care about, right?
Yeah, exactly. And trust can be used for all sorts of things, like protecting assets for someone with special needs or managing money for a child until they become an adult.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And I imagine setting up a trust that requires a lot of planning and legal expertise.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, they're complex legal things, and it's really, really important to get professional advice to make sure they're set up correctly and that they follow the law.
Yeah. So if someone's thinking about setting up a trust, it's definitely a good idea to talk to a lawyer who specializes in that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, they can guide you through the whole process and explain the different types of trusts and help you figure out which one's best for you.
Okay, so we've touched on executors and beneficiaries and trusts. What are some other key things people should keep in mind when they're, thinking about creating a will or updating one?
Yeah, one really important thing is just making sure that your will is actually legally valid. So that means following certain requirements. For example, it has to be in writing, it has to be signed by the person making the will, and it needs to be witnessed by two people.
So it's a pretty formal process, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's also super important that the language used in the will is clear and easy to understand, to avoid any kind of misinterpretations or arguments later on.
Right. You want to make sure that your intentions are crystal clear so that there are no problems or legal challenges later on. So does that mean you always have to get a lawyer involved?
It depends, on how complicated the will is. For a really simple will, like if you're leaving everything to your spouse, a DIY kit might be okay. But I would be careful with those, especially because there are specific legal things you need to do to make sure it's all valid.
So it's kind of like weighing the pros and cons, right? The convenience of doing it yourself
Yeah.
versus, having the peace of mind of knowing that a professional has done it right.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And even a small mistake in the wording or how you sign it, it can make the whole will invalid.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so having a lawyer can help you avoid those problems.
Okay. So let's say you've decided to, get professional help. What can you expect when you work with an estate planning lawyer?
Yeah, so they'll walk you through the whole process. They'll ask you lots of questions to really understand what you want, what assets you have, what your family situation is like, and they'll also explain what different decisions mean legally and help you structure your will so that there's less risk of problems.
Yeah, it sounds like having that expert perspective could be really reassuring, especially when you're dealing with things like trusts or guardianship arrangements, those kinds of things.
No, for sure. Yeah, they can help you think about challenges that you might not have even considered and make sure your will follows all the rules.
Now, once the will is actually written, what about signing it? Is it just a matter of, scribbling your name at the bottom?
Not quite. Yeah, the signing process has to be done in a very specific way to make sure it's legally valid. You need two witnesses there.
So it's a very formal thing with specific requirements to prevent anyone from challenging the will later on.
Exactly. And once it's signed and witnessed, you need to think about where to keep it.
Oh, that's a good point. I imagine it needs to be somewhere safe and easy to access.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So, like a fireproof safe or a secure deposit box at your bank are good options. And it's also a good idea to tell your executor where it is.
Right, right. So it's about finding that balance between keeping it secure, but also making sure that the right people can get to it when they need to.
Exactly.
Okay, so what happens if, your life changes? Like you get married, have a kid, inherit a bunch of money. How do you update your will to reflect those changes?
Yeah, for small changes, you can add an amendment, which is called a codicil. But for big life changes, it's usually better to make a whole new will that cancels the old one, just to keep things clear.
Right, so it's like hitting the refresh button, making sure it's always up to date with what you want.
Exactly. A will isn't just a one-time thing. It should change with your life.
Right. Now, before we move on to like the actual steps of making a will, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, dying intestate. It's something I think a lot of people don't really understand.
Yeah, it's an important point. Dying intestate means dying without a valid will. And if that happens, then your assets are divided up based on these intestacy laws, which might not be what you would have wanted at all.
So even if you think your estate is simple or you don't have a ton of assets, having a will just make sure that your choices are respected.
Exactly. It gives you that control and peace of mind. And it keeps the courts from deciding what happens to your stuff, in a way that you might not have liked.
Wow, that's a powerful reminder of why taking the time to make a will is just so important.
Definitely.
It's not just about, the legal stuff. It's about having a say in what happens after you're gone.
And it's never too early to start thinking about these things, because things change. You might get married, have kids, you might buy a house, your values might change. Life happens.
Right. So it's not just about making a will and forgetting about it. It's about checking it every so often and making sure it still reflects what you want.
Think of it like an ongoing conversation you have with yourself about what you want to leave behind and the impact you want to make.
That's a great way to put it. It's not just about the legal stuff. It's about your values. It's about your wishes.
Absolutely. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. There are people who can help you.
Mhm.
Lots of information out there.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. We've broken down the whole world of wills, talked about trusts, and really highlighted why having a will is so important no matter how old you are or how much money you have.
Yeah.